Father, we praise you. We thank you for the gift of this day and time. Help us to realize what a gift every single day is, and help us to live it and enjoy it as your gift. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. Okay, we're still in the prophecies of Isaiah, and we're in chapter 34, verse 5. Okay, so he says, "For when my sword is seen in the sky, look, it will fall on Edom, on a people destined for destruction." Edom was a country immediately to the east of Israel, and it was a country that, much like Moab, that it was never strong enough to conquer Israel. But if Israel was like under oppression with the Romans or something like that, they would raid Israel. So they took advantage of Israel every time Israel was not really strong, but they were never strong enough to attack on their own. He says, "The Lord's sword is sated with blood. It is greasy with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of kidneys of rams." What they're talking about, the sword, because of the references here with the blood of goats, lambs, and the kidneys of rams, they're actually talking about a knife that is used at the temple for sacrifice, because those were the animals killed in sacrifice. And when you sacrificed an animal, certain parts of the animal had to be sacrificed in a certain way. And we normally imagine an animal thrown on the fire and burned, but that's not true. They cut out organs, and they used organs that had a lot of fat. You know, the kidneys have fat sitting on them. So they used organs with a lot of fat in order to get the thing. And a certain part, like if you were to sacrifice a lamb, a certain part of it would go to the priest, a certain part of it would go to what I guess like a soup kitchen type thing that the temple maintained for everyone who needed food, stuff like that. But the animals were very strictly thing. The only time an animal was burned entirely was a sin sacrifice, because the whole idea was that if it's a sin sacrifice, there's somehow sin connected with it. So they didn't eat that, they just, sacrificed it. But what he's saying is that this sword that's going to fall on Edom is a very well-practiced sword. This sword knows how to do all these sorts of things. So he says, "For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah, a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Wild oxen will be felled with them, bullocks with the bulls. Their land will be drenched with blood, their dust made rich with fat." And it's the idea that when the people are slaughtered, they'll be slaughtered in the same way the animals were slaughtered, and the blood and everything will be on the land. "For this will be the Lord's day of vengeance, a year of retribution in Zion's lawsuit." And this lawsuit, if you remember, it's actually a couple chapters earlier, because he's been going through these condemnations. But a couple chapters earlier, the people prayed that God would judge between them and Edom. And so he says, this is the answer to the lawsuit. He says, "Its streams will turn to pitch, its dust into brimstone. Its land will be blazing pitch." Pitch is, I think is tar. And the area that we're talking about in the world is probably one of the most geologically active in the whole world. And largely because of, like the Dead Sea, that's the lowest point on the face of the earth. So on the face of the earth, the closest you get to the boiling core is that area. And so the pitch is something you can see there on the surface sometimes of water. In ponds and things, you can just see the pitch. And I think that's the thing that has made the Arabs rich in that area, is the oil on that side of Jordan. And so it describes that the pitch, before they knew how to sell oil, pitch was not a very good thing to have around because it polluted your land and killed your crops and ruined your water and this sort of thing. So they see it as something terrible. It says, never quenched, night or day, its smoke will go up forever. It will lie a waste age after age. No one will travel through it forever and ever. And it's interesting that in that area, even to this day, is a pretty empty area. Like when you cross the border into Israel, it is very crowded. And as you go down the coast into what today is called Palestine, that's very crowded as you move down into Egypt and stuff. But for some reason, that area, just the other side of the land, which is Jordan, mainly the country of Jordan, is very, very, very empty. It's almost like all desert. It says, hawk and hedgehog will claim it. Owl and raven will make it their home. The Lord will stretch over it the measuring line of chaos and the plumb line of emptiness. So what he's done is the first part, we condemn the people. They were slaughtered. The second part, the land itself is condemned. The only one I'm looking at in this is the hedgehog. I think a hedgehog requires more water than you would find there. But most of these animals, like the hawk, the raven, the owl, these are animals that dwell away from people. Like there aren't people around where these animals live. They shall call it no kingdom there, and her princes will come to nothing. Thorns will grow in its fortresses, nettles and thorn bushes in its strongholds. And so the places that they used basically to raid the Jews, which were these little fortresses where they would go out and raid the Jews and stuff, these things will be destroyed. One of the interesting things you discover if you read consistently through the Bible is there is a heavy condemnation about anything that serves in war or anything that commemorates war. Like they say that every boot that ever tramped in battle will be destroyed, and the monuments to war will be destroyed. I don't know if you think about this, but to me it's very curious to be in like Washington, D.C., where 3/4 of the monuments are to generals or wars or this sort of thing. And I think with the, the business of the Confederacy in the South and the removal of all those statues, I would like to see them remove more, even from the Union side, more of the statues that simply deal with war. It would be better to see these people as people who are, let's say defenders or soldiers just in uniform, but without the guns and all that sort of stuff. One of the things that drove me crazy, I was in New Orleans for 10 days, but one of the things that drove me crazy, I guess I had never realized it before because I've been to New Orleans many times, is a statue of Andrew Jackson. That they have a statue of Andrew Jackson in front of the cathedral there. Now, he led a battle, I think, that defended New Orleans against the British, was it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so that was a very successful thing. But he's the man most responsible for the decimation of the American Indian. He, I don't know if I told you this, but when I read the papal letter on the environment, one of the key things the Pope says is that when you consider the interrelation of species and this sort, so that you get rid of this, you don't realize you've killed off that, this sort of thing. He says that they forget native peoples because native people are part of that structure where it is. But it reminded me of something about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson said, if you want to get rid of the Native Americans, kill the buffalo. That he understood that relationship. If you get rid of the buffalo, you can destroy the natives. And that's exactly the way it went. He says it will be the lair of jackals, the abode of ostriches. Wildcats will meet up there with hyenas, likely. The satyr will call its mate. There lieth, two will alight. Lieth appears to be a fictitious character in the mythology of the Arabs. And I think it's even mentioned in the Quran, but as sort of it's not an evil spirit, but it's not a benevolent spirit either. I don't know how I would say it. He says, and lieth too will alight and find a place to rest. The snake will rest and lay eggs there, will hatch and gather its young into the shade. Vultures will assemble, each one with its mate. Search in the Lord's book and read. Not one of these will be missing, not one of them lacking a mate. For from his mouth there came forth the command, and his spirit has brought them together. He has thrown the lot for each. And the idea is that having put in these animals that largely live away from people and everything, he assigns mates to them so that that's what stays there, that it'll never be reset up against or anything. It says, his hand has measured out their share with a measuring line. They shall claim it as their own forever, and live there from age to age. And the ones that will claim it are the ostrich and these animals, so it will basically belong to these animals. Having done that, then he turns to Jerusalem. As this reading all the way through has gone, it turns to Jerusalem, sometimes to discuss blessings, sometimes to discuss punishments, sometimes, but Jerusalem is like the thread that goes through this one way or another. So we turn to Jerusalem, and this is one of the promises of the renewal of Jerusalem. He says, let the desert and the arid lands be glad. Let the wasteland rejoice and bloom. Let it burst into flower like the crocus. Let it rejoice and sing for joy. Okay, you notice that he started with the destruction of the people in, what was the area, I forget now. But he started with the destruction of the people in that area and then moved to the idea of the destruction of the land. Now he turns to Jerusalem and begins with the positives for the land. Then he'll move on for the people. But this idea that there will be water, basically. And so in the desert, you see these plants bloom and stuff like this. And the key to the success of Jerusalem, all over the Mideast, the key to success is simply water. You know, if they could ever arrange a treaty between the Palestinians and the Jews, one of the most amazing things that they could do is they could connect the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea. And by fixing the proper amount of water, they could have water, huge amounts, pour into the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea never raise. Because the Dead Sea, the evaporation is huge because of the heat there. And as the Dead Sea rises, then its surface increases too. And so, but they could generate hydroelectricity probably for both countries, just through something like that. And the other thing is, because of the way the Dead Sea is, you can mine it. You can mine it for potassium, for salt, for this sort of thing. And Israel does a lot of that on the edge of the Dead Sea, and so does Palestine on the other side. But they, if they could just get organized about there are a lot of things they could do together powerfully for both of them. I think oftentimes, I shouldn't say oftentimes, always, that war doesn't benefit anyone. Everyone suffers as a result of it. I think that's what they're trying to convince the Russians with Ukraine, for them to attack Ukraine and everything. Of course, they're more powerful and they aren't going to lose a war with Ukraine, but they won't benefit from it, period. That stuff doesn't work that way. He says the glory of Lebanon will be given to it. Now, remember, the term Lebanon means garden, and Lebanon was regarded as the most verdant area in the Mideast. And again, much like our redwoods, it wasn't that they had a lot of rain, but they have this fog that comes up, and the cedars of Lebanon survive on their ability to convert this fog to drop it to the ground on them and water themselves, exactly like the redwoods in California. They don't necessarily have water, but have the ability to sort of rain this fog down on their own roots. And so they became the symbol of verdance. And again, the name Lebanon means garden. The next thing is the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. Carmel, the mountain, Carmel is a range of mountains, goes right down the center of Israel. But these are the mountains that prevent the fog from going into where the Israelis normally live, which is in the Jordan Valley. But there's growth on the top of the mountains for the same way the cedars of Lebanon grow. And Sharon is a valley where they do a lot of farming now. But when the Jews first went to Israel, Sharon was a swamp. And the largest number of Jews who died in the return to Israel died of malaria because of the mosquitoes in Sharon. And then they drained it. In the days of Jesus, it had been drained earlier than Jesus. So it was a very verdant area. But under the Ottoman Empire, that whole area was really abandoned. And so it became a swamp again. But in the days that this is written, that was probably the best farmland in all of Israel. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. And I think something to understand about this, he's saying all this is going to be done. But when he talks about all this, occurring in Israel, notice that he's saying it's so that they can see the splendor of God, and that somehow the splendor, the power of God is best seen in nature working, in its benevolence in nature. And I could certainly tell you I felt that very strongly in the Galapagos Islands, that you see nature in a very, very different way. I think if we were to take our own country, many animals have learned to be afraid of humans, and that hasn't happened there. And there are several animals that prey on humans. That doesn't happen there. It's just a very, very strange way to live. And so anyway, so he says, strengthen all weary hands, steady all trembling knees, and say to the faint-hearted, be strong, do not be afraid. And the idea is, think of this in terms of the Exodus. In terms of the Exodus, they were going on this very wide route in order to get to the Holy Land. And in the process, I think an entire generation died. But the idea was that they should keep moving, that they would ultimately arrive. And I saw a commercial on TV based on the Edison thing, and they talked about how many people in history have stopped just short of success in all different things, and that the fact of the matter is to have this stick-to-itiveness. And he's saying this about when to be really exhausted. I think the best example of this, personally in my own mind, is Nelson Mandela, who was in prison, and still had this relationship where he constantly prayed and believed that the land would change. And then when it did change, because he always believed it would happen, he was not vengeful when he got into the thing. He says, this is what was supposed to happen, and we're going to do it. And, you know, if you can imagine he had been vengeful, you'd have seen a horrible, horrible civil war take place in the whole thing. And then ultimately blacks would have won, and it would simply have been reversed. They would have enslaved the whites. It was a setup for that. And he made sure it didn't happen. But part of it is this, there's something about faith, just faith, not just religious faith, but there's something about this belief in success that really, I don't know how to say it, that really forms a way a person views life. The most successful people, I think, in life are people who hold to the belief that they will be successful. But many of the people who hold to the belief that they will be successful appear in the whole process to be much less successful than some people who abandon the belief ultimately in the success. But this belief in success is really a sustaining thing and makes people very strong and allows them to deal in a certain way with success, you know, and I think it's particularly true if you attach it to God, because the whole idea that is if I'm successful because God made me successful, then I better be very careful what I do with my success, lest he suddenly decides someone else should be successful. That you to the degree we believe in success and success as a gift from God, I think we live life very, very differently. And so he says, be strong, don't get discouraged. Here is your God. He says, vengeance is coming, divine retribution. He's coming to save you. And again, I think oftentimes in this, the way Scripture is written, there's a lot of the hand of people. I believe it's inspired, but there's a lot of the hand of people in it. And so that when we think of God saving us, we think in terms of his punishing the ones who are oppressing us. But the more you read in the Christian scriptures, you kind of get away from that. That God does not have to put someone down to raise me up. God does not have to punish someone to benefit me. God doesn't have to take from someone to give to me. I think that, you know, where you actually see this is in a purely communist setup. An example of a purely communist setup is a monastery, you know, where in the monastery everyone receives what they need and everyone contributes what they can. And it was interesting as a member of a religious order. In the religious order, I had access to more art books than I could have afforded if I weren't in the order, okay? However, I didn't have a stereo set. Although the guy in the next room who was majoring in music did, you know, but he didn't have the art books. But everyone had what they needed, and really in abundance. And it wasn't as though I thought he was better because he was in music. I don't think he thought I was better because I was in art. But all these people have these things, and you have a man, let's say a man who enjoys teaching. I'll give you an example. If you are in a religious order and really like teaching, you'll spend your whole life teaching. You'll never have to be a principal. You'll never have to be an administrator. You can teach, okay? Now, if you go in the system, if you go into, let's say, the educational system, well, there's more money in administration, and there's more money in administrating administrators, and, you know, this sort of thing. But in a religious order, the man who's elderly and sits at the door to greet people when they come in, because that's all he can physically do, has the same life, the same food, the same rooming as anyone else in the whole thing. And I think in a society, if you can somehow set something up that way, where each person can do what they actually want, I think everything would be met. It's just a matter of, you know, why should a person, like for instance, I think if I don't want to get too far off this, but I think if you're talking education, I think nothing but people with majors in psychology should teach the first 5 grades. Because the key to the first 5 grades is to have confidence in yourself and to find out how you learn. Once you got that done, then you can begin to have teaching, to go on. But there's all kinds of things about somehow making, the thing is, you'd never have a psychologist there for the pay they give for a teacher. And there's no sense that one should be paid less than the other in a society. People should actually get, what they need. But I think if it were done, it would work out that way. And God's coming to save us means that you arrive, what makes you strong, what makes you good, what makes you this. So, and we continue on now, and you see why this has become considered one of the prophecies, Messianic prophecies. He says, then the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unsealed. The lame will leap like the deer. The tongue of the dumb will sing for joy. Okay? So it's easy for us to read that and see the miracles of Jesus. But they're talking something much, much wider. The eyes of the blind will be open has much to do with the society in which they lived. You were careful not to see things, that you were an oppressed people, you didn't look people in the eye, this sort of thing. And the same thing with ears, with deaf will be unsealed. You didn't want to know what was going on. So a lot of this, as it's put in the prophecy, is that you can live very differently in a benevolent society than you can in an oppressive society. And I don't know how many people here visited, let's say, the Soviet Union in the days of the Soviet Union. But if you went, you noticed everyone dressed in gray, no one looked you in the eye, and you never, ever saw anyone smile. It was really a depressing situation. And that's just the way they lived, That I'm reading the biography of Angela Merkel, and it's very interesting that when she came into the freedom of the West, that she carried that experience with her and was very cautious about, allowing a society to go that way. But anyway, so we see that as a prophecy of the Messiah, which certainly any prophecy about the joy and the benevolence of Jerusalem is about Jerusalem producing the Messiah. So it goes on. It says, for water will burst forth in the desert, and streams in arid lands. Parched land will become a marsh, thirsty land, springs of water. Lairs where the jackals used to live will become plots of reed and rushes. Now, reeds and rushes, are shallow ponds, and they remember this from Egypt. You'd never find these in Israel, but you remember these from Egypt, where they were raising the papyrus on the edge of the Nile. He says, and through it will run a highway, which is called the Sacred Way. This passage that we're beginning right now, to me, is one of the most important. And I believe it's a description, basically, of the liturgy. But he says that this pathway is going to be called the Sacred Way. And this pathway is going to run through all this wonder that God creates. It says, the unclean will not be allowed to use it. It shall be for God's people, and the fool will not stray on it. And what it means is that, first of all, there's no danger on it. Okay, we're going to see that go on. That when you get on it, it is for God's people. So this, first of all, to be on this path, you have to want to be on it. And it says no fool will go astray on it. You can't get on this path by accident. You must have the intention of getting on this thing. He says no lion will be there, no predator set foot on it. None shall be found there. And this idea that the people who are on this path are actually safe. They will be on the same. Now, in the author's mind, he's describing the return of the diaspora to Jerusalem. So the return of the Jews that have been spread throughout the world, and because of the different things that happened in Israel, will then come and return to Israel. But I think for me, it's a description of the path to holiness. And we follow it through the liturgy. But this path, no one gets there, without wanting to be there. But you don't end up on there by accident. But if you follow that, this idea that there's no danger there, it is a path of safety that will take us where we're going. He says, the redeemed shall walk there. Those ransomed by the Lord shall return and come to Zion, shouting for joy, crowned with joy unending. Rejoicing and gladness will accompany them. Sorrow and sighing will take flight. So what he's doing is describing that, with the enemies destroyed, Israel will then be restored. And when Israel is restored, then the people of the diaspora will return and come back, this sort of thing. It's an interesting thing to find out what would happen if real peace were to break out in the Mideast. The thing that is curious about it to me is how many Jews choose to live away from Israel today, largely because of the violence, okay? But I wonder how many of them would actually return. And like we saw, a large group returned from Ethiopia that came back to Israel, but it's because the conditions in Ethiopia became so bad. But you think, like in the times I've been to Israel, when you see the impact on a Jew when they step off the plane in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv, where the airport is, it's unbelievable. And you watch it in person after person after person after person. And I get the impression a lot of people would move there if they could live there in peace. That a lot of people would live there. So, what we're talking about now is, this is called, in the way the text is put together, a historical appendix. And in the prophecy of Isaiah, there are historical things to sort of set the stage, and then we have the prophecies that go on. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, advanced on all the fortified towns of Judah and captured them. Like you notice the man's name, Sennacherib. When we think of cherubs, we think of these little tiny naked babies in Italian paintings. But cherubs are actually, if you've ever seen pictures of the gates of Babylon, they are like the Sphinx. They have the body of, I think they have the body of a cow, they have the tail of a lion, the face of a man, and the wings of an eagle. And they were mythological guardian spirits that were used in the Mideast. But that's cherub, and you oftentimes find the word cherub in the names of princes around this time in the area. So his name is Sennacherib. And he advanced and captured the cities. From Lachish, the king of Assyria sent the Rameshaken with a large force to Hezekiah in Jerusalem. The Rameshet took up a position near the conduit of the upper pool on the road to the fuller's field. The master of the palace, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, Sinab, the secretary, and the herald, Joah, the son of Ashf, went out to him. So this troop comes in, and they're sitting down at the the upper pool on the road to the fuller's field. This King Hezekiah built probably, I would say it is arguably the most significant engineering feat of the ancient world. Like people would talk about the pyramids and everything, But in the city of Jerusalem is on top of a mountain. And he dug a tunnel down to a spring at the bottom called the Gihon. And he started the tunnel. This to me sounds absolutely crazy. But he started the tunnel at both ends. You know, like if you came down from the top, you could be a few feet off. If you came up from the bottom, you could be a few feet off. But if you start from both ends and you're a few feet off, that's a disaster. But that's exactly what happened. And they heard one another. They were just close to one another, and they broke through. And then what he did was seal up the spring, the Gihon, and the water rose in that tunnel. And there's a huge pool called the Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem. And that was the water source for Jerusalem. So Jerusalem had the most, that's why it was such a strong city. The advantage of being on a hill, it's easier to defend, but there's no water. The advantage of being in a valley, they can't siege you because you have all the water you need. Well, Jerusalem was on top of a hill and had all the water they needed, thanks to Hezekiah, which was, just a remarkable thing. But they're talking about the pool that is down near the spring. There was a pool beside the spring, too. And had anyone had the sense to figure out that this thing, they could have broken it out and emptied the whole thing if they wanted, but they didn't know that. They thought this little pool here was all that spring was producing. So it's sort of the overflow from it there. And so the Ramashad then said, "Say to Hezekiah, the great king, the king of Assyria, says this, what makes you so confident? Do you think empty words amount to strategy and military strength? Who are you relying on?" So he sends a message to Hezekiah. He wants Hezekiah to surrender. And one of the things in the ancient world, very often there was sort of an agreement between kings that, if I conquered your country, I would at least allow you to live. Okay? And really powerful nations didn't do that. Babylon didn't do that. Alexander didn't do that. But many of the power, and so kings would easily commit their countries to a war. They were going to survive anyway. So, they relatively easily did it. I don't know if you know this about the American Revolution, but one of the things about the American Revolution is in the British forces, you never shoot anyone who's an officer. And as a result of that, there are 4 instances recorded where George Washington was in the sights of a British, and they don't shoot officers, okay? The Americans were not so nice, but the British were. So he says, who are you relying on that you have rebelled against me? Look, you are relying on that broken reed Egypt, which pricks and pierces the hand that leans on it. So he says, you're leaning on Egypt, but that's like trying to lean on a broken stick that you're going to, when you need support, you're actually going to be pierced by it. Such is Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to all who rely on him. This is a period when Egypt wasn't particularly strong. Egypt was not going to be conquered by these people, but Egypt they preyed on the edge of Egypt at this time. He says, and if you say to me, we rely on the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and altars have been suppressed by Hezekiah, who told Judah and Jerusalem, this is the altar before you which you are to worship? And see what he's doing, he's looking at Hezekiah. He says, you destroyed all of these altars. Now Hezekiah did that because God told the Jews not to let any other altar be built except the one in Jerusalem. The Jews were not to build another altar to Yahweh in another area, that they were to come to Jerusalem. And the reason is, if you watch in the history of Israel, when they have two temples or two altars, they eventually think they have two gods. And that happened with the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a group of people who were planted in Israel by the Babylonians. When they took out the Jews as prisoners to Babylon and slaves, they put another group of people there. And the group of people they put there, the Samaritans, basically believed that gods were territorial. So when they arrived there, they started worshiping Yahweh. And when the Jews came back under Ezra and Nehemiah, when they returned to Jerusalem, then the Samaritans wanted to contribute to the rebuilding of the temple. And so they put together all this gold, the silver, wood, all this stuff, and they sent it on a caravan up. And the Jews had a discussion among themselves as to whether they should receive it, because they considered them pagans, okay? And so they refused to accept it. So when that was sent back to Samaria, Samaria built their own temple to Yahweh in the city of Samaria. And curiously, if you're going in Israel, you go on largely level land, and then you begin the ascent that will take you up eventually to Jerusalem. Well, this temple was just before the ascent, and a lot of Jews began to worship in this temple because it was easier than going to Jerusalem, you know. And as a result of that, the Jerusalem they never closed the Samaritan one until the Romans did. But the Jews would close the other temples that had been built by Jews, and they were to Yahweh. But the enemies here think that because you've destroyed those altars to Yahweh, Yahweh isn't going to stand by you. That's what they think. He says, "Very well then, make a wager with my lord, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses if you can put riders on them. How could you repulse a single one of the least of my master's servants, as you rely on Egypt for chariots and horsemen?" And this idea of horses, again, if you visit Israel, there are 3 sites in Israel where you can see the stables of Solomon, where Solomon built stables to retain horses. None of them are anywhere near Jerusalem. The reason is Jerusalem's a mountain. You don't have chariots there, and horses would not be particularly useful there. But if you go to Megiddo, there are huge stables in Megiddo, but Megiddo's in the center of a plain. Okay, so there are places like that where they had them, but not in Jerusalem. He says, "Further, have I come against this land to lay it waste without the consent of the Lord? The Lord himself said to me, 'Go up against this land and lay it waste.'" So he's saying that he's playing on the Jewish belief. I don't know what that man's belief himself is, but the Jews have almost a puppeteer view of God, that God manipulates everything. So like in Exodus, you'll find out God hardens Pharaoh's heart and then punishes him for having a hard heart. And the fact is that just doesn't make sense, you know. But because the Jews believe the cause of everything is God, well, he plays on it. He says, "Do you think I would even be here if God didn't want me here? Do you think I couldn't fight you if God didn't want me to fight you? You don't think I couldn't conquer you if God didn't want me to conquer you?" So this is what they're playing. So Eliakim, Sherah, and Joah came to the Retribution. "Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in Hebrew, in the hearing of the people on the ramparts." And this what he's saying, they don't want the people from Jerusalem who are on the walls of Jerusalem to defend, they don't want them to hear this. Why? Because it makes a lot of sense from the Jewish point of view. Would that army be there if God didn't will them there? Would they be that much stronger than we are if God didn't will them to be that much stronger? Okay? But the Retribution said, "Do you think my Lord sent me here to say these things to your master or to you? Was it not to the very people sitting on the ramparts who are doomed to eat their own dung and drink their own urine with you. Okay? So he says, these people know what a siege will do. And he says, so they're to hear me. Retribution then drew himself up and shouted loudly to Hebrews, listen to the words of the great king of Assyria. The king says this, do not let Hezekiah delude you. He cannot save you. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to rely on the Lord by saying the Lord is here to save us. This city will not fall into the hands of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for the king of Assyria says, make peace with me, come out to me, and every one of you will be free to eat the fruit of his own vine, his own fig tree, and to drink the water of his own well, until I come and take you away to a country like your own, a land with wheat and wine, a land of bread and vineyards. What he says is that when I conquer you, he says, I'm not going to kill you or destroy you or anything. You'll be fine here, and then I'll take you to another land. Actually, they're going to go off as slaves. He wants them as slaves in the other land. Is it a land flowing? Is it his land as rich as Israel? It certainly is. I mean, it's a very rich land as well. But in Israel, they're free. In that land, they'll be slaves. But that's not what he says. He says, I'll take you off to this other land. Okay? He says, don't let Hezekiah delude you by saying the Lord will save us. Has any God of any nation been able to save its country from the hands of the king of Assyria? The Assyrian army was very powerful, and they conquered a huge one. They're one of the great early empires. And so the Assyrians had really spread out very well. And the idea is that, every country had a god, every town had a god, and that they always saw the victory over a country as really being a victory over the gods of that country. Like if you watch Exodus, Exodus is seen much more as a victory of Yahweh over all the gods of Egypt than it is seen as a victory of the Jews over Pharaoh or something like that. But what you had was this thing. And it's fascinating too, because if you could sit back and look at it in the days of Moses, if you would look at it, it would be unimaginable that the Yahweh would overcome the gods of Egypt just from numbers. Like Egypt had thousands and thousands of gods. The thing that we know now and the thing that the Jews held, there actually is only one God, So these are all statues or pictures or animals or whatever, but they are really nothing. But in the early days, the people of Egypt and everything thought of them as gods. And you'd imagine our God Yahweh is coming up against this whole tribe of gods. But they revealed they were nothing. Yahweh was the thing. So that was the thing. And so he says, where are the gods of Hamath or Arpad? Where are the gods of Severvain? Where are the gods of the land of Samaria? Did they save Samaria from my hands? Which of all the gods of these lands rescued their lands from me, that the Lord should be able to save Jerusalem from my hands? And again, this whole idea that God ultimately is in charge, period, okay? And you could say that nothing worked. And I oftentimes think of this in medical issues. Like remember the story of the woman, there was the gospel today at Mass, of the woman who had the hemorrhage. They came up beside Jesus. Well, Mark, who records it, first of all, records that she spent all her money on doctors and had exhausted her funds and everything. Well, the thing is, you look at that story, no doctor could cure her. But that didn't mean God couldn't. And he did, And so this whole thing of You cannot look at anything arrayed against God as diminishing God. It just doesn't, you know. And I think one of the sad things about being a human being is that we tend to think of God in terms of, you know, power. Like, for instance, if I have a headache, I pray to be relieved from the headache. And I'm a person who always calls for the intercession of the saints, because I know what they do for a living. And so when I have a headache, I call on Cosmas, Damien, and Gemma. They're 3 medical doctors, all of whom are canonized saints. And so a headache, call on them, you know. You get cancer, you go right to Jesus, okay? This is a whole different level. We tend to think that way, but for God and the saints, nothing is a thing. It's all, you know, very simple. So they, however, kept quiet and answered him not a word, since the king had given them the order, "You are not to answer him." Okay? Saying King Hezekiah, when he sent them out, he says, "You are not to say anything to them, lest they think that's the decision I'm making." Okay? So you have to be careful. Remember the thing between Russia and the United States the other day, that the representative from Russia said something and Putin immediately said that was a confusion of the message, it didn't count, you know. And the thing is, you have to be very careful when a representative is speaking for you. So he says, "The master of the palace, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, Shema, the secretary, and the herald Joan, son of Ash, with their clothes torn, went to Hezekiah and recorded what the Rabashan had said." Okay, so we'll call it there, and we'll start it on verse 37 next time. And what has happened now, they've gotten the word that they're saying that nothing can defend them, and that they've been told that none of the other gods have successfully defended their people against the Assyrians, so they shouldn't think that they themselves are going to be defended against the Assyrians. So we'll leave it there and go on. I think you know that one of the prophecies connected with Hezekiah is that you will conceive and bear a child. A virgin will conceive and bear a child. So that comes from the prophecy in this section, but we'll get to it later. Any other questions?